What if ancient scholars held secrets to unlock your mind, hidden skills to remember everything, even the names of every star in the sky or every line in a massive book? What if these powerful methods developed around the year 1200, slipped through history's fingers, vanishing like whispers on the wind? What if the key to an astonishing memory lies not in our future, but in a lost past? Number 5. The Brotherhood of Shared Sanctuaries. Imagine a group of medieval monks, their faces etched with the quiet intensity of long study, gathered in the chill air of a scriptorium. They are not just copying texts, they are building something together, piece by careful piece, not with stone and mortar, but with shared thoughts. This is not a common memory palace where one person mentally constructs their own unique building of knowledge. This is something different, something collective, something communal. This is the Brotherhood of Shared Sanctuaries, a technique whispered among certain cloistered orders, a way for an entire community to inhabit and reinforce the same intricate mental space. Consider the challenges of medieval life. Books were treasures, copied by hand, sometimes only one copy existing in an entire region. Information spread through spoken word, through sermons, through lengthy debates in university halls. To remember the vast body of knowledge from theological doctrines to complex legal precedents was not just useful. It was essential for survival, for spiritual guidance, for intellectual authority. A single monk might spend decades memorizing sacred texts, entire gospels, the voluminous writings of church fathers. But what if the burden of remembering could be distributed, or rather reinforced, by a shared mental architecture? The Brotherhood of Shared Sanctuaries began with a common familiar physical space. Perhaps it was the monastery itself, its cloisters, its chapter house, its refectory, its chapel, its garden. Every archway, every stone pillar, every stained glass window was known intimately by all the members. But this shared physical space was just a blueprint. Over countless hours of shared contemplation and rigorous recitation, these familiar locations were imbued with layers of collective meaning. For instance, a specific corner in the chapter house, where daily readings were held, might be designated as the mental repository for the Rule of Saint Benedict, the foundational text for many monastic orders. Each line, each concept, was not just placed there by one monk. It was placed there by many, through a communal act of mental placement. When a passage was recited aloud, the group would simultaneously visualize its placement in that specific corner, seeing the imagined scrolls unrolling, the mental figures associated with the concepts performing their silent duties. The strength of this method lay in its reinforcement. If one monk faltered in his recollection, another, having placed the same information in the same mental spot, could prompt him, not just with the words, but by guiding him back to the shared mental location. It was like having a shared mental blueprint, a group mind navigating the same intricate memory landscape. Think of a labyrinth, not just walked by one person, but explored by a dozen, each memorizing the turns and pathways, then collaboratively correcting each other's mental maps. This communal memory palace was built through daily practice. During their evening gatherings, perhaps after Vespers, the monks would not just review their individual studies, but actively walk through their shared sanctuary in their minds, section by section. Brother Thomas, lead us through the virtues housed in the refectory's north wall, one might say, and Brother Thomas would describe the mental images, the allegorical figures, the specific objects he had placed there, each detail affirmed or subtly adjusted by the shared understanding of the others. The scent of cooking bread might be mentally associated with charity, a particular wooden bench with humility, the warmth of the hearth with brotherly love. These sensory details were agreed upon, solidified through repetition and communal mental quarkloads. The imagery used was often highly standardized within the community. If a particular saint was represented by a specific animal or symbol, that symbol would be used consistently throughout the shared sanctuary. If a certain theological argument was visualized as a wrestling match between two allegorical figures, every monk would picture the same struggle in the same mental location. This created a powerful network of interconnected knowledge, where the memory of one reinforced the memory of all. For a new novice joining the order, the process was one of slow, painstaking immersion. He would be guided by older monks to the existing shared sanctuary, learning not just the information, but the specific mental locations and the agreed-upon imagery. It was a form of oral tradition, but instead of simply passing down stories, they were passing down the very mental architecture that contained their shared intellectual heritage. It was like learning a secret language, where the words were not just sounds, but mental pathways to specific chambers of collective knowledge. The Brotherhood of Shared Sanctuaries addressed a fundamental challenge of memory in a pre-printing age: the fragility of individual recollection. If one scholar died, much of his unique mental library could be lost. But with a shared sanctuary, the knowledge was distributed, embedded in the communal mind, making it more robust, more resilient to loss. It was a distributed memory system before the concept of distributed systems even existed in technology. Why did this powerful technique fade? As the printing press began to disseminate knowledge more widely, the urgent need for perfect, universally shared mental recall diminished. Books became the new shared memory, a physical, externalized sanctuary that did not require the same rigorous communal mental construction. The emphasis shifted from perfect internal recall to the ability to consult external sources. The communal mental building gave way to the printed page, and the quiet shared mental walks through the Brotherhood's sanctuary became less frequent, eventually becoming a lost art, a whisper from a time when the mind itself was the most precious library. Number 4. The Celestial Sphere of Correspondences. Imagine a scholar in a darkened room, perhaps a university professor in the late 13th century, surrounded by astrological charts and astronomical instruments. He is not just looking at the stars, he is building a memory palace that mirrors the cosmos itself. This is not a simple terrestrial building. This is the Celestial Sphere of Correspondences, a sophisticated method that intertwined the nascent sciences of astronomy and astrology with the art of memory, creating a palace that was both a map of the heavens and a repository of knowledge. In the medieval worldview, the cosmos was a living, interconnected entity. The movements of the planets, the constellations, the zodiac signs were believed to influence everything on Earth, from human temperament to the fate of nations. Scholars like Robert Grosseteste, a prominent English bishop and philosopher around the year 1230, deeply explored the nature of light and its connection to the divine, seeing the cosmos as an ordered, luminous whole. It was only natural, then, to extend this understanding to the architecture of the mind. The Celestial Sphere of Correspondences began by mapping the known heavens onto the structure of the memory palace. The outermost sphere of the fixed stars, the zodiac, the 7 planetary spheres, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon, each became a distinct level or section within the mental construct. Just as each planet was associated with specific qualities, metals, colors, and even human organs, so too would these associations be used to encode information within the memory palace. For example, the sphere of Mars, a planet associated with war, iron, and a fiery temperament, might be the mental location for remembering texts on military strategy or legal disputes. The images placed there would be vivid, perhaps red in color, involving clang of metal or the heat of battle. A scholar needing to recall the nuances of a complex legal argument might picture a Roman legionnaire clad in fiery red armor, holding a set of scales, his face contorted in a marsh grimace, placed precisely within the Mars section of his celestial palace. The zodiac, divided into 12 houses, offered another layer of precision. Each zodiac sign, Aries, Taurus, Gemini, and so on, had its own set of characteristics and correspondences. A scholar might assign specific fields of knowledge to each sign. For instance, the sign of Gemini, associated with communication and duality, could be the mental compartment for rhetorical principles or dialectical arguments. When a speaker needed to recall a complex oratorical structure, he would mentally navigate to the Gemini house of his palace, finding the vivid, perhaps twin-like images he had placed there, representing the different rhetorical flourishes. This method was particularly useful for remembering complex, multifaceted information that required a hierarchical or categorized structure. A physician, for example, might use the planets to categorize diseases or remedies. The sphere of Saturn, associated with melancholy and slowness, might house knowledge about chronic illnesses or specific herbs used to calm the mind. The sphere of Venus, linked to love and beauty, could hold information about pleasant remedies or the properties of fragrant plants. Each plant, each illness would be transformed into a striking, personalized image, imbued with the planetary associations, and placed in its correct celestial sphere. The act of moving through this celestial memory palace was not just a mental walk. It was a cosmic journey. To recall a piece of information, one would mentally ascend or descend through the planetary spheres or orbit the zodiac, experiencing the mental images infused with the energies and qualities of their celestial location. This added a layer of experiential learning, making the process of recall more dynamic and perhaps more memorable. The scholar was not just recalling facts. He was re-experiencing a miniature cosmos within his own mind. The deep reliance on astrological and astronomical principles meant that the scholar needed a profound understanding of these sciences. The accuracy of the memory palace depended on the correct mapping of celestial correspondences. It was not enough to just know that Mars was fiery. One needed to know its specific influence on the body, its relationships to other planets, its ruling houses, and its symbolic animals. This technique was, therefore, likely practiced by highly educated individuals, those who moved in academic circles, where astronomy and astrology were considered essential branches of natural philosophy. For a theologian, remembering the hierarchy of angels and divine beings could be mapped onto the celestial spheres with the highest heavens, holding the most sublime truths. For a lawyer, different legal codes or precedents could be associated with different planetary influences, allowing for a systematic recall of vast bodies of law based on their underlying principles. Why did the celestial sphere of correspondences become less prevalent? The scientific revolution slowly chipped away at the geocentric model of the universe and the pervasive influence of astrology. As astronomy moved away from divination towards mathematical observation and prediction, the rich tapestry of symbolic correspondences began to unravel. Cosmos, once seen as an animate, meaningful entity that mirrored human experience, became increasingly viewed as a mechanical, indifferent machine. The powerful, almost mystical connection between the human mind and the vast heavens, which was so central to this memory technique, began to dissipate. The palace built on stars and planets, once a common mental dwelling for the educated, slowly faded, becoming another forgotten architectural marvel in the history of the mind. Number 3. The echoing cloister, sonic architecture, and resonant word forms. Imagine walking through a medieval church, its high ceilings soaring, the stone walls absorbing and reflecting every sound. The chants of the choir swell and fade, echoing off the ancient pillars, filling the space with resonant vibrations. This is not just a place of worship. It is an acoustic landscape, and for some medieval memory masters, it was the inspiration for the echoing cloister, a lost technique that focused on the auditory and resonant poorly visual. Stories, poems, and epic tales were recited aloud, often from memory. Even reading a book was typically an oral act, with scholars murmuring the words to themselves or reading aloud to students. The sound of words, their rhythm, their cadence, their very acoustic presence was deeply ingrained in the medieval mind. The standard memory palace method, the method of loci, often emphasizes vivid visual images placed in distinct locations. But the echoing cloister took this a step further, making the sound of the information a central element of its placement. A specific memory location within the imagined cloister would not just hold a visual image, it would also resonate with the sound of the words or concepts placed there. For instance, a monk needing to remember a complex theological argument might mentally place its key points along a specific corridor of his imagined cloister. As he mentally walked that path, he would not just see allegorical figures representing the arguments. He would also hear the specific words or phrases associated with them, echoing and reverberating in the imagined space in a particular way. A crucial counter-argument might be placed in a mentally dead spot, where sounds were muffled and indistinct, representing its weakness. Powerful, undeniable truth might be placed in an imagined vaulted chamber where its words would resound with clarity and strength. This technique required a refined sense of auditory imagination. A scholar would learn to associate not just images, but specific acoustic qualities with different parts of his memory palace. Perhaps a particular archway in the mental cloister would be known for producing a deep, sustained echo, perfect for remembering a solemn vow or a fundamental truth. A narrow, winding staircase might be imagined as muffling sound, suitable for less important details or whispered secrets. The imagined quality of the stone, the height of the ceilings, the presence of water or other elements would all contribute to the unique acoustic signature of each mental location. Consider a scholar preparing a lengthy sermon for the congregation. He would break the sermon into sections, assigning each section to a distinct part of his echoing cloister. As he planned his rhetoric, he would mentally rehearse the sound of his own voice, hearing how the key phrases would resonate in the imagined chapel, the crucial arguments echoing powerfully from the mental pulpit, the comforting words of blessing reverberating gently from the altar. The rhythm and flow of the words were just as important as their meaning. The memory palace became a mental soundstage, a perfect acoustic environment. For remembering poetry or epic narratives, this method would be invaluable. The scholar would not just remember the sequence of events. He would remember the very sound of the verses, the rhyme, the meter, the particular way a hero's name would echo in a grand hall, or a villain's threat would hiss from a dark corner. Each line, each stanza, would have its own acoustic signature within the mental landscape, making recall an act of rehearing, not just reseeing. This technique was not just about recalling information. It was about internalizing it in a deep sensory way that tapped into the powerful oral tradition of the time. The words were not abstract symbols on a page. They were living sounds, vibrations that filled an imagined space. The scholar's own voice, mentally projected into his echoing cloister, became an integral part of the memory process. Why did this method, so attuned to the oral nature of medieval learning, become less common? The invention of the printing press fundamentally shifted how humans interacted with information. Books, once rare and primarily vehicles for oral performance, became widely available. Silent reading became more common. The emphasis in education gradually shifted from perfect oral recall to the ability to extract information from the written page. The sound of words, once paramount, took a backseat to their visual representation. The intricate mental architecture of the echoing cloister, designed for a world where sound was king, slowly faded, replaced by mental libraries of silent, visually ordered texts, leaving behind only faint echoes of its former glory. Number 2. The Palace of Moving Statues, animated effigies and gestures. Imagine visiting a grand cathedral in the 14th century and marveling at its intricate sculptures. Not just static figures, but perhaps the famous clockwork automata, elaborate mechanical devices that could move, speak, or perform complex actions. These were wonders of medieval engineering. For some medieval memory masters, these mechanical marvels and the expressive power of human gesture inspired a unique and powerful memory technique, the Palace of Moving Statues. This method took the idea of memory images and injected them with life, making them not static figures but dynamic, performing entities within the imagined memory palace. The standard memory palace method advises the use of striking or unusual images to make them memorable. Palace of Moving Statues pushed this concept to its extreme. Instead of simply placing a vivid image of, say, a giant ox in a mental marketplace to remember something about agriculture, a practitioner of this method would imagine the ox doing something. Perhaps the ox would be plowing a furrow, or bellowing a specific phrase, or even performing a little dance, all in service of encoding a piece of information. The human body, its gestures, and its movements were also considered powerful mnemonic tools. Medieval orators, actors, and even preachers used elaborate gestures to convey meaning and emphasize points. A hand raised in blessing, a head bowed in submission, a dramatic sweep of the arm to encompass a vast idea. These were all forms of communication. The Palace of Moving Statues incorporated this. The figures within the mental palace were not just statues. They were effigies that moved, acted, and gestured, silently or audibly delivering their encode information. For a student of rhetoric needing to remember the different figures of speech and their application, this technique would be invaluable. He might imagine a specific room in his mental palace dedicated to the art of persuasion. In one corner, a statue of a wise old man might be imagined making a gentle, persuasive gesture, his lips silently forming the words of an opening argument. In another, a fiery figure might be seen striking a dramatic pose, representing a powerful emotional appeal. Gesture, each movement, each nuanced facial expression of these mental statues would be carefully designed to embody a specific rhetorical device or principle. Consider a scholar studying law. He might assign a distinct room in his palace to each major legal code. Within the room, for Roman law, he would place figures representing key legal concepts. Perhaps the concept of contract would be represented by two figures shaking hands, their movements conveying the binding nature of the agreement. Concept of justice might be a blindfolded woman, her scales swaying slowly and precisely. These were not mere pictures. They were living dioramas, playing out their specific parts within the mental landscape. The emphasis on movement also made the memory images more engaging and distinct. Our brains are naturally drawn to movement and change. A static image, no matter how striking, can become rote. But an image that is always doing something, that is dynamic and interactive, remains fresh and distinct in the mind. The scholar would mentally choreograph these moving statues, making their actions and gestures as precise and meaningful as possible. This method also involved a degree of active mental performance. When a scholar wanted to recall information, he would mentally trigger the action of the relevant statue. He would watch the figure perform its assigned gesture or action. And through that dynamic mental display, the associated information would be retrieved. It was like having a living, interactive database within the mind, where each entry was a miniature play. Creation of such a palace required immense imaginative effort and a deep understanding of human movement and expression. It wasn't just about placing images, it was about animating them, making them agents of memory. This speaks to a time when visual literacy, understanding the symbolic power of gestures and poses, was perhaps more highly developed than it is today. Medieval art, with its often dramatic and symbolic portrayals of figures, might have provided a natural training ground for this kind of visual and kinetic memory. Why did the palace of moving statues become a lost technique? Cognitive load required to consistently animate a vast array of mental figures, each with its own precise action, is enormous. As memory techniques became more systematized and perhaps simplified for broader application, the sheer mental gymnastics required for constantly choreographing these living statues might have been deemed too cumbersome for general use. Furthermore, the cultural emphasis shifted. The rise of printed texts and the eventual dominance of abstract, conceptual thought over highly visual and embodied forms of knowledge may have made such a labor-intensive, dynamic method seem less essential. The bustling, animated memory palace of moving effigies gave way to quieter, more static mental libraries, leaving behind a remarkable testament to the imaginative power of the medieval mind. Number 1. The charnel house of senses. Olfactory and gustatory imprinting. Imagine entering a medieval spice market, the air thick with the aroma of exotic cloves, pungent peppercorns, and sweet cinnamon. Or perhaps a bustling kitchen, filled with the scent of roasting meat and simmering herbs. Then step into a charnel house, where the smell of damp earth and ancient bones permeates the air. This intense sensory experience, particularly focusing on smell and taste, formed the foundation of one of the most intriguing and perhaps unsettling lost medieval memory techniques. The charnel house of senses, or sometimes known as the sensory sepulchre. This method leveraged the primal power of forgotten and often disturbing smells and tastes to anchor memories with unforgettable intensity. While most modern memory techniques focus almost exclusively on visual imagery, medieval memory masters understood the profound and often overlooked power of all the senses. Smell in particular has a direct and powerful link to memory and emotion, bypassing many of the brain's analytical pathways. A specific scent can instantly transport us back to a moment in time, triggering a cascade of associated memories and feelings. The medieval world was a much more olfactorily rich environment than our own, filled with a cacophony of natural and artificial scents, both pleasant and foul. The charnel house of senses did not shy away from this sensory reality. In fact, it embraced it, particularly the more visceral and even repugnant smells and tastes, because these were considered uniquely memorable. The human mind tends to remember extreme or unusual sensory experiences with greater fidelity. While a beautiful flower might be pleasant, the overwhelming stench of decay or the sharp, metallic taste of blood is far more likely to be seared into memory. A practitioner of this technique would construct a memory palace, but instead of focusing solely on the visual appearance of locations and images, they would deliberately imbue each mental location with a distinct and often disturbing smell or taste. For example, if a scholar needed to remember a particularly unpleasant historical event, perhaps a great famine or a plague, he might mentally place the details of that event in a corner of his memory palace that was explicitly associated with the putrid smell of rotting food or the sickly sweet odor of disease. The memory image of the famine victims would be inextricably linked to this overpowering, sickening odor. Conversely, a memory of a joyous feast or a sacred ritual might be associated with the rich, comforting taste of consecrated wine or the sweet aroma of incense. The key was the intensity and specificity of the sensory detail. It was not enough to merely think of a smell. The practitioner would attempt to evoke the physical sensation of the smell or taste, mentally, breathing in the imagined aroma or savoring the mental flavor. This method was particularly potent for remembering abstract concepts or moral lessons. A scholar might assign the concept of gluttony to a mental chamber that reeked of stale, rancid food and cloying sweetness, evoking the physical disgust of excess. The virtue of temperance, on the other hand, might be associated with the clean, fresh smell of spring water and the simple, wholesome taste of plain bread. The more visceral and distinct the sensory impression, the stronger the mnemonic link. The term charnel house itself points to the medieval fascination with mortality and the powerful sensory associations that came with it. Charnel house, where bones of the dead were stored, would have been a place of powerful, undeniable smells, the damp earth, the decay, the dry dust of forgotten lives. To mentally imbue parts of one's memory palace with such unsettling but potent sensory markers was to create a landscape of unforgettable impressions. A philosopher remembering the vanity of earthly desires might place such thoughts in a mental space that smelled of coffin wood and cold, damp stone. The deliberate use of unpleasant or shocking sensory details went against later, more stylized approaches to memory. Medieval texts, while sometimes hinting at the power of vivid or unusual images, rarely explicitly detailed the use of highly specific, disturbing olfactory or gustatory cues for memory. This might have been a closely guarded secret of certain practitioners, or perhaps simply too unsettling for widespread dissemination. Why did the charnel house of senses largely disappear from the memory arts? As society became more refined and hygiene improved, the daily sensory landscape shifted. People began to distance themselves from the more extreme smells and tastes that were commonplace in medieval life. The intellectualization of knowledge, the move away from the visceral and towards the abstract, also played a part. The emphasis on cleanliness and pleasantness in daily life perhaps made the deliberate evocation of foul odors or tastes for memory purposes seem less appealing or even crude. Furthermore, the very intensity that made this technique powerful also made it potentially unpleasant to practice regularly. Who would want to constantly evoke the smell of decay or the taste of bile, even if it aided memory? Over time, the more gentle and visually focused methods prevailed, pushing the more visceral and potentially disturbing charnel house of senses into the shadows, a lost technique that speaks to a different kind of memory, one deeply rooted in the primal, often unsettling sensory reality of the medieval world.